Okay, in this video, I'm going to talk about cognitive development. I'm going to talk a little bit now about Jean Piaget. Piaget is a Swiss researcher, and he's one of the first researchers to start making the connection that children are different than adults in the way they think, right? Children don't have the ability to think like adults. Now, other researchers are kind of seeing this beforehand, but it's Piaget who really describes the ways in which children are different cognitively than adults. I'm going to go over Piaget's 4 stages, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about a 5th one. So Piaget's 4 stages are sensory motor stage, preoperational stage, the concrete operational stage, and the formal operational stage. And today, a lot of research suggests that there's yet another level, which we often call post-formal stage. But I'm going to start there with the sensory motor stage. If you're in the sensory motor stage, then you are 0 to around 2 years old. And infants in this stage don't think almost at all, not the way adults do. They don't have the ability to manipulate the thoughts in their heads. Now, that doesn't mean that nothing is happening in their brain. In fact, a lot of things are happening in their brain. They're internalizing a bunch of information. They're learning to categorize information. By the time they're 2, they're going to be able to speak rather well. Usually they start speaking by around 12 months old. They're going to have expectations of the world. They're going to know that if you drop something, it should fall. And if it doesn't, if you do like a magical trick on a baby and it doesn't fall, they're going to be curious about that. They're going to sort of look and scrutinize and try to make sense of why is it not working the way it's supposed to work? Why is this thing not falling to the ground? By the time a child is about 1.5 years old, they are going to develop object permanence and self-awareness, but they cannot manipulate information in their mind. They can't force themselves, for example, to remember something that happened yesterday. And if you ask a 1-year-old or a 1.5-year-old something they did yesterday, what did you do yesterday? They're going to say stuff to you, but it's going to not be related to what they actually did yesterday. Sometimes they just make things up. And you might think that this little kid is lying. And of course, in the past, that's what people used to think. They used to think that little kids were just bad and that they were lying. And people would sometimes say things like they have the devil in them. You have to beat the devil out of them. And they meant you have to like spank a child to get the devil out of them. But today, because of researchers like Piaget, we understand that the problem is not that the child is intentionally lying. It's that the child can't conjure up a specific memory because they don't have the mental capacity to do that, not during their sensory motor stage. And of course, that's going to include almost any other kind of manipulation. If the child wants to do something, it's hard for them to formulate a plan to do a specific task. They can mimic adults right away. If the adult does something, the child can mimic the adult, and you can teach a child to do certain things through operant conditioning and classical conditioning. But besides that, the ability for them to actually think, create a plan, and then put that plan into action just doesn't happen until a child is around 2 years old and they're starting to leave their sensory motor stage. Now, by the time the child is 2 to around 7, they start to enter the pre-operational stage. And this child can manipulate things in their mind. They can make a plan. They can start to remember, especially once they get to around 3, 4. You could ask a child who is 4, what did you do last year? And they might be able to remember a specific memory from last year. And be able to explain that to you. Now, obviously, they already learned object permanence, self-awareness, mental representations. If they say, I would like to have cereal, they can imagine the cereal box in their brain. And they can go, the cereal box is in the pantry. So if I want cereal, I have to get into the pantry. And then they can set a plan into motion to try and get that cereal. A child at the pre-operational level can do that. Again, as I mentioned or sort of alluded to, a child in the pre-operational stage, starting at around 2, very early, they're going to start to fast map. And that basically means that they're going to start to learn language really fast. So at the sensory motor stage, by around age 1, they start learning 1 or 2 words. But by 2 years old, they start to learn a lot of words, real rapid fire. And they start being able to put those together rather fast. And then, of course, they will develop the ability to have cooperative play. And they're going to learn a lot of things here. Numbers, sort of the names of the numbers, that numbers mean, one thing, that you can count things with numbers, that there is a stable order to numbers. And then, of course, eventually, that if you count something, the largest number you get to, that's how many things there are. Kids during this stage often have private speech, so they'll talk out loud as if though they're talking to another person. But in reality, they're just thinking to themselves. They might say things like, I should try to put this block on top of this tower. And it sounds like they're talking to somebody else, but in reality, it's just their own sort of internal monologue spoken out loud. Eventually, they'll internalize their internal monologue and it'll just happen inside their mind. But at first, they literally say it out loud. We do this as adults too sometimes, especially when something is complicated or we have to think about something that's complicated. Sometimes we say things out loud to ourselves to force ourselves to focus. But children, especially early in the pre-operational stage, only have private speech. It's during this stage also where children start to be able to understand gender, that you can label people a certain gender, girls or boys, that gender is stable. And so usually a boy tends to always be a boy. And by the time they're around 6 years old, they start to develop gender constancy. And they start to realize that not only am I a boy right now, and I'm going to be a boy later on today, but that I'm always going to be a boy, or that I'm always going to be a girl. Now, it also happens at around age 4 that children start to develop theory of mind. And you're going to read a little bit about that, but I just want to touch on it. During theory of mind, what happens is that the child starts to understand that other people have minds that are different than theirs. I don't always love this term theory of mind or theory of mind mechanism, because it sounds like the scientific theory of mind, and that's not what it is. This is the child's theory. The child starts to have a theory that they make up themselves, that other people have minds that are different. Before around age 4, children don't understand that. And if a child knows something, they assume that everybody else knows it too. A child, you might tell a child that inside of this box of crayons, there are candy. And if I ask a 3-year-old, hey, 3-year-old, Susie has no idea what we've been talking about. And I'm going to ask Susie, what is inside this box of crayons? What do you think Susie's going to say? And that 3-year-old is going to say candy because they imagine I know that it's candy. And so therefore, Susie will know that it's candy too. Children who are younger than 4 don't get that other people's minds are different. But right around 4, the child is going to be able to make that mental leap. And they're going to say, Susie is going to think that it's the box of crayons is full of crayons because a box of crayons is usually full of crayons. And she's not going to know what I know, that is in fact full of candy, right? All of a sudden, by age 4, a child can understand that. For example, to test theory of mind, I would have a child sit in, let's say, the taller seat first, where the clown is. And I'm going to ask the child, what do you see? And the child's going to say a couple of things: a tree, an owl, a lake. And then I'm going to have them switch seats. And then I'm going to ask the child again, what do you see now? And they say a river, a bush, a tiger. But then I'm going to ask him, hey, what do you think the clown can see? And if he was older, if he was 5 or 6, he might be able to say that the clown can see a tree, an owl, a lake. He'll remember what he saw when he was in the tall seat and imagine that that's what the clown can see. But before the child is around 4, the child cannot do that. And when you ask the child, what do you see? He's going to name the things that he's currently seeing while he's sitting in the short chair. And so he's going to say, the clown sees a river, the clown sees a bush, the clown sees a tiger, all of which are the things that he can currently see now while he's sitting in the short seat. Because this child has not developed theory of mind well. Now, what a child cannot do is have logical thought processes the way adults do. And in fact, most of their logic is going to be disturbed by something. And there's just a few things that are almost always going to disturb a child's ability to be logical at the preoperational stage. One of them is concentration. And let me just show you a couple of things here. If I have 2 beakers filled with water in this case, or juice, in the other video available, you'll see that they're filled with juice. If I ask someone at the pre-operational stage, which one of these beakers has more water in it or more juice? Well, the child is going to say they both have the same amount. But then I'm going to take one of the beakers and I'm going to pour them into the cylinder. And now I'm going to say, which one of these has the more juice? And if the child is at the preoperational stage, they're going to look at the cylinder and they're going to say the cylinder has more juice. And if you ask them why, they're going to say, because it's taller. Now, they just saw that, in fact, when they were both in a beaker, they looked the same and they were the same amount. But when you put it in the cylinder, they are going to consistently say that the cylinder is more. And you can go back and forth and ask them several times, pour the water back in the beaker. And oftentimes, especially if the child is young, they're going to continue to say that the cylinder has more juice. I can show a child several quarters and ask them which line has more quarters, this line or this line. And again, if the child is young, they might literally count the quarters and say 5 and 5, they both have the same. But if I spread the quarters out and right in front of them, I don't have to hide anything. I can spread the quarters right in front of them and say, now, which one of these lines has more quarters, this line, or are they the same? And the child is going to pick the longer line. And they're going to say, because it's longer, because it's bigger, it has more quarters. They're not even going to try to count it out because the child is going to centrate. They're going to focus on the most obvious trait, whether that is the water looks taller in the cylinder or this line of quarters is longer. They just focus on centration on the the most obvious trait. Now, that's not the only way that a child's logic is interfered with. Um, Children at the preoperational level also believe that appearance is reality. And you're going to get some weird things here with children. A child might have a glass of milk, and then they'll put on a pair of sunglasses. And because the pair of sunglasses are dark, the milk looks dark, it looks brown. And so they still say, oh, I'm going to wear my sunglasses because I rather have chocolate milk. And they'll drink the milk and they'll go, I love chocolate milk. Because they believe that since they can see the milk become brown because of the sunglasses, that must mean that in fact the milk is truly brown because it is now chocolate milk. They cannot imagine that the world is different than the way they see it. Also, you might have noticed, especially if you have, little brothers and sisters or nieces and nephews or kids, if you put on a mask in front of them, they believe that you are that mask, that you're that monster, or that you are, I don't know, Spider-Man, because they're seeing it, and so they believe that that is the truth. Um, Animism uh, is when children believe that inanimate objects um, have living qualities. A child knows that the desk isn't going to have baby desks and that if you cut the desk, it's not going to bleed. The child understands at the preoperational stage that desks aren't alive. And yet they still believe that the desk might have some living traits, like that the desk might be naughty. And so if they bump into the desk and it hurts, they might think that the desk did it on purpose. Or that if their dolly falls down, that in fact Dolly might have hurt herself and that she has a boo-boo, things like that. And then, of course, artificialism is a child's belief that everything was created by a person. And so they're going to ask weird questions like, who made the moon? And who put the mountain there? Because they believe that some person must have done that. Because they believe everything was, if at one point, created by a person. Now, at this stage, because of interference and because of the child's inability to create logic very well, other forms of logic are just going to be too hard for them. Conservation, which is the idea that the water, in this example, will hold its mass even though the shape of it has changed. It will have the same amount of volume. A child cannot understand that. Uh, Reversibility is difficult for a child. It's difficult for a child to understand that if you change one thing to a different thing, that then you can change it back. And that's why it's really hard for children to do sort of certain types of math problems, right? So they'll know that 5 plus 3 is 8, but if you ask them, then what is 8 minus 3? They're not going to follow because it's hard for them to do the reversal there. Now, by the time that they are closer to 7, that's a lot easier for them to do without having to do the actual computation. So again, logic is very difficult for children at the preoperational stage. Now, by the time the child is 7 to around 11, they are in their concrete operational stage. And these kids can do logic pretty well. All of a sudden, there aren't a lot of mental problems distorting their ability to do logic. And if you have kids, it's right around this time where you start to kind of feel like, oh, this kid is pretty smart. This kid is pretty brilliant. Because before around 7, they were making simple mistakes. But right now, starting around 7, they are just sort of leaping to logical conclusions, and they're pretty smart. They're doing it pretty well. Now, they're not perfect. They're still young, and so they're still going to things that they're going to need to learn, better memory strategies, better ways of remembering things. But the logic, they're starting to get that, and they get smarter. It feels like every day. Now, there is certain logical things that are going to be difficult for the child at the concrete operational stage. And specifically, they're going to have problems with hypothetical and abstract problems. So let's say I have a kid. You might see this video, which I've posted, uh, and I'm going to ask the child, we're going to play a game. And so I'm going to give you 2 rules, and then you're going to tell me what the conclusion is. And so uh, I'm going to say, if you hit a glass with a hammer, the glass will break. That's rule 1. Rule number 2 is Mary hit a glass with a hammer. What's the conclusion? What happens? And the kid is going to say, the glass broke. But when I ask him why did the glass break? The child is going to say, because a hammer is hard, because a hammer can break a piece of glass. And you go, yeah, well, that's obvious. But if I change it up, if I give them a magical situation, you see how they can't really do the problem. They're just focusing on the concrete world. So I'm going to change it up and give them a magical situation. So I'll say, rule number 1, if you hit a glass with a feather, the glass will break. And rule 2, Mary hit a glass with a feather. So what's the conclusion? What happened? And the kid, the concrete operational child, is going to say nothing. Why? Why nothing? Because a feather is soft, they will say, right? What's happening there is that the child cannot follow you into the abstract world, into this hypothetical. In this world, a feather can break a glass. That's a hypothetical that a child cannot reach. Instead, the child will consistently say, no, a feather can't break a glass because a feather is too soft. At the concrete operational stage, they understand the concrete world, the real world, and it's very difficult for them to leave that and follow you into a hypothetical world. Now, by the time a child is around 11, then they can do this. And they might feel like it's a very silly thing. You'll say, you know, if you hit a glass with a feather, the glass will break. Mary hit the glass with a feather, and what's the conclusion? And the child, the 11, 12-year-old child, is going to say, the glass broke. And when you ask them why, they're going to say, because you said the first rule was if you hit a glass with a feather, the glass will break, right? So they're following the hypothetical rules instead of the concrete world rules that they are used to, right? It's because of this reason why children at the concrete operational stage are going to have a hard time with algebra concepts. It's not that they can't do the computation. It's that they have a hard time understanding the abstract nature of algebra. For example, at the concrete operational stage, a child is going to have a hard time doing the problem 3 plus x equals 10. But if you ask them to do the computation by taking out the x and just putting in a square and say, what's the number that belongs there? They can do that at the concrete operational stage. But the abstract thinking that the X represents an unknown, that's very difficult. As they get older in the concrete operational stage, when they're 9 or 10, they are going to have a hard time with 4y equals 12. But if you change that and you make it 4 times what number equals 12, that they'll have an easier time with, because they don't have a problem with the computation. They have a hard time with the abstract thinking that this letter represents an unknown. That's very difficult. But by the time they get to the next stage, their formal operational stage, now that won't be so difficult. Now, by the time the child is 11 or older, then they are entering their formal operational stage. And for Piaget, this was the last stage. Here, the child can think hypothetically, they can think abstractly. Um, the child basically thinks like an adult. And for Piaget, someone at the formal operational stage, an 11-year-old, a 12-year-old, could learn any logical thing that an adult could learn. It might take them time, right? But you can begin to teach them any logical thing that an adult understands. Now, Piaget understood that there were some issues early on in the formal operational stage. And one of the ones that he talks about the most is the idea of idealism. In idealism, the child focuses on their mental representation of the world, their ideal version of the world. And if the real world doesn't match their ideal world in their mind, the 11-year-old, maybe even that 20-year-old, will believe that the real world is wrong and that their ideal in their mind is right. And the younger the child is, or the younger the child in the formal operational stage is, the harder it is for them to break that. And that's why you get, especially a lot of preteens who just sort of throw tantrums and get very overwhelmed when the world doesn't go the way they assume it will go. A child, for example, might have an ideal version of what a mom is supposed to be like. And if their real mom doesn't match the ideal version of mom in their mind, they get incredibly overwhelmed by it. They will throw tantrums and they'll say, why can't you be normal? Things like that. Sometimes their idealism will affect them in ways that you don't even see coming. You might teach a child how to like cook a certain recipe, for example, and the recipe calls for, let's say, olive oil. And there's no olive oil, but there's some corn oil. And the teen might say something like, oh, there's no olive oil, so you can't do it because the thing isn't right, or it's not going to come out right. Because again, they have this version of the way to cook this item in their mind, and they can't seem to break it because the reality, right? In their mind, reality is wrong. There has to be olive oil, or we can't do it. A good buddy of mine told me of an experience he had. This young guy he works with was working on an AC unit, and the AC unit was slightly different than the one that he had learned to work on. And the guy goes, there's nothing we can do here. The pump is on the wrong side, right? Now, my friend is older. He's in his 30s, and so idealism doesn't affect my buddy. He's 30. That doesn't bother him. And so it's easier for my friend to go, who cares? The pump is on the wrong side. Well, that's where it is. We have to work on this machine the way it is in reality. But for the younger guy, it's hard for him to break apart from that, to go, oh, yeah, just because it's one way in my mind doesn't mean that's the way it's going to be in the real world. And I have to learn to live with the things the way they are in the real world. world. Now, I always like to make the point that idealism isn't all bad, right? There are certain things where being a little idealistic helps, right? We all have a mental representation of what is justice, for example. And the world doesn't always fit those mental expectations of what justice is supposed to be. And when you're older, when you're in your 30s and 40s, it's really easy to say, well, that's just the way the world is. Yeah, of course, idealistically speaking, it shouldn't be that way, but that is the way the world is. Whereas 20-year-olds, teens, often see the injustices of the world and it bothers them. And they say, no, we have to change the world, right? The world is wrong and we have to change the world. And it's why most changes, whether you're talking about, the American Revolution or what's happening now in the world, it's usually young people who push for those changes because it's often young people who rebel against this idea of injustice or the world is just the way it is. So idealism isn't all bad, but in some ways it can interfere with logic. Now, um, especially in your teen years, but in your 20s as well, there's a little bit of egocentrism. Now, for a teenager, egocentrism is a little bit different than for a child. For a child, egocentrism means the child can't really understand that other people think differently from them or that people are separate beings from them. A teenager understands that, but a teenager has a hard time caring about how other people are experiencing the world. And so maybe mom has said something to the effect of, oh, I don't even know if I can pay all the bills this month. I'm so behind. And later on, the teenager might ask, Mom, can I get $20 so I could hang out with the friends? And the mom will say, no, you can't. I just told you I don't even have enough for bills. Well, a teenager, especially if they are sort of being consumed by egocentrism, they're going to, I can't believe that you won't give me $20. I help out around the house. I do this or that. And they really can't see from their mom's perspective. Now, it's not that they don't have the mental capacity. If I ask that, let's say, 13-year-old, why did your mom not give you the money? Do you think she doesn't want to? Does you think she's bad? They can follow logically why she can't give them $20. But in that moment, it's very difficult for them to focus on the cognitive skill that they have. And instead, they are more likely to focus on the emotions that they're feelings without necessarily caring about the emotions that mom might be feeling. They don't take time to think about that. Um, Teenagers also tend to have what we sometimes call an imaginary audience, and they believe that they are, in fact, the center of everybody else's world. And so you see this a lot with teenagers. They'll get like a little stain on a shirt, and they imagine that everybody has noticed their shirt and everybody's talking about them or everybody's making fun of them because they really do imagine that everybody cares about what's happening in their life. I used to teach both middle school and high school, and kids, teenagers will often tell their teachers, you did this on purpose because you hate me. Or they imagine that their teacher loves them, that their teacher, thinks about them all the time, when their teacher just barely knows their name, right? Especially in middle school and high school, that teacher has hundreds of students. The idea that one of them is super important in comparison to all the other ones tends to be a kind of silly idea, except that most teenagers feel that way. And it's not until you get much older that you start to realize no one is paying attention to me. And even if someone does notice my stain or that person really doesn't like me, it doesn't matter. They have other things going on. I'm not the only thing that matters in their life. Um, the personal fable, on the other hand, is another feeling that teenagers tend to have, which is the feeling that they're the first ones to ever have gone through that emotion. And sometimes it's quite unique. They'll say things like, no one else knows what I feel like, right? And they really believe that. They really believe that no one else, no other student could feel the emotions that they're feeling. And sometimes a little bit more broad. They'll say things like, to their parents, they might say, "You just don't understand. It was different when you were young." And of course, for the most part, it wasn't. Most adults went through most of the things that most teenagers go through. And yeah, there's things that are different, obviously, but most things just really aren't. And it's not until you're much older that you start to realize, oh, yeah, of course, my mom is just a person and she went through all the same things that I probably went through. Um, but teenagers tend to believe that their life experience is very unique in comparison to everybody else. Now, I mentioned that uh, other researchers, more modern researchers, have started to suggest that there is yet another stage of cognitive development, which is often called post-formal thought. And in post-formal thought, it's probably where you are, especially if you're in your late teens, 18, 19, 20s. You should have started to wonder, how do I know that what I know is right? How do I know that everything my teachers taught me, everything my parents taught me, is correct? And when you're younger, there is a little bit of dualistic thinking. Everything is either right or wrong, black or white. But eventually, you start to break away from that. And your thinking starts to be a little bit more relativistic. And so now, not everything isn't either or, and you start to focus on the circumstances. Um, and during, especially when you're young and you're starting to enter relativistic thinking, you'll hear people say things like, "Who can say what's right or wrong? What's right to you might be wrong to me." That is maybe a 20-year-old, maybe even a 25-year-old who is sort of thinking higher level, but hasn't sort of developed further into their relativistic thinking. As you get older, hopefully, although not everybody does this, you will start to be able to give value to things. And you might say, yeah, it is important to make money or for the economy to work. But, I think it's more important that we don't spill oil all over the land. And so, yeah, it's important that, I turn my lights on and the lights work and that the ATM works, but we still can't have oil all over the ground, all over the natural world. And so you give value to some facts over others, and then you're able to come to a conclusion. Therefore, I think that, I don't know, running a pipeline through some wilderness is bad. Now, just as easily, you could think the opposite. You might think, yeah, it's bad to have oil spills, but without piping that oil to where it needs to get to, then we won't have lights or internet. And so that's more important. And basically, now you've given value to the opposite idea, and that's what you think is right. And so, two people who are at the same level of thinking can come to two different conclusions because they value different facts over others. And so, not everybody is going to agree. That doesn't mean that they're not both being sort of honest thinkers or intelligent thinkers. It just means that they value different things. Now, that's not always true. As I mentioned, not everybody reaches this level, and some people are just faulty in their thinking. And you won't really know that unless you have the mental capacity to say, Why? What are you valuing that makes you come to that conclusion? And that is very complex. Usually you're going to be in your like 20s, 30s, even 40s and 50s for some people before they're capable of doing that. And a lot of people can't do it well. Now, I do want to make one more point in this video, which is Vygotsky. Okay, so Vygotsky is a different researcher who is also looking at cognitive development. And whereas Piaget believed everybody went through stages, and in fact, we still believe that everybody goes through these stages, Vygotsky focused on a different aspect of cognitive development, which is culture. Uh, Vygotsky focused on the fact that some cultures value certain cognitive skills over others. And so therefore, those things that that culture values, people are going to learn them faster or better. So if you happen to be from a family who cares a lot about language, there's a good chance that that person is going to learn language better. And if you come from a family who cares a lot more about math, there's a good chance that child is going to learn math better. And the other child who comes from a family that likes to fix cars, well, that child is going to learn a lot about cars a lot faster than the other two, because we depend on other people to teach us, other people who have more expertise to teach us. That could be our parents, older siblings, older friends, somebody who is more skilled in a specific area. And to Vygotsky, this is what explains certain cultural traits that we sometimes see in kids. Um, in my culture, uh, if you go to Puerto Rico, one of the things that you will see is that little kids, really, really young kids, talk a lot. And they, in fact, have just a great way of expressing their feelings and explaining what happens in a certain situation, to the point that if you're not used to it, you go, holy smokes, that kid's pretty bright. Now, one thing that my culture doesn't value quite as much is following instructions, especially for children. And so what you tend to find is kids who are just sort of running around and they have a hard time, forming a line and, doing exactly as they're told, because that's not quite as important. That's not a value that we sort of impress into children. You come to the United States and it's almost the exact opposite. Children, we expect them to follow rules. And so kids are very good at lining up and raising their hand and following directions. But often you will ask, that 3-year-old to explain something, and they're like incredibly shy and they don't want to talk, because culture matters. And the specific way in which it matters is that there are expectations, and adults, number one, place those expectations on the children and then teach them how to do it well. Now, Vygotsky also focuses on what we call the zone of proximal development. And the zone of proximal development is the limit of your knowledge and abilities right now. What is the limit of everything you know right this moment? And when you get to your limit, well, you can't figure out the next step, not on your own. Most people cannot. And so you need someone to scaffold that information for you. And that basically means to teach that information to you.